There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and to another In Other Words. In Other Words is a series I've been doing for years and years and years, but very episodically, in which I talk about word origins and etymologies for words and expressions I find in my reading. But I have trouble getting a sense of momentum with this series, so I often only put out 1 or 2 or 3 episodes a year. So I have decided to do with this series what I have started doing with book hauls, which is to commit to getting at least 2 a month out, but smaller. So I typically would do 6 words or expressions in one episode, and I'd get 2 or 3 of those out. 2 or 3 of those out a year, I mean. But if I can commit to getting In Other Words episodes out at least twice a month, maybe even a bit oftener, I get a whole bunch more of these words to you, and that would be good for me, and might even be good for 1 or 2 of you. I always like to remind you that I am not a professional. I do my research online in etymological dictionaries and the like, and have a great time with it. But sometimes the most scholarly, most trustworthy information that comes out of these videos is what you find in the comments. So please check those out. All right, so the first of my 3 words this time is cupido, and this comes from a Japanese novel originally published in Japanese in 1959, translated into English in the early 2000s, as Rachel Maddow would say. The River Key by Sawako Ariyoshi, translated from the Japanese by Mildred Tahara. And this paragraph, I'm not going to read you, I don't need to read it to you, but this paragraph is about the protagonist's daughter who is quite a rebel. She's a tomboy and she is coming of age around the Pacific War period or shortly thereafter, and she is rebelling against gender stereotypes and social conservatism of all kinds. And so one of the ways that she rebels at school is to wear the wrong colored hakama. A hakama is a wide Japanese trousers that men and women wore, and in many situations still wear in formal occasions. And at her school they were to be maroon hakamas, and she wore the green ones and got into lots of trouble. And then she rebelled again by hanging 20 cupidolls from the trimming of her hakama and got into trouble for that. So cupido, I am aware of cupi for a couple of reasons. I lived in Japan for almost 15 years until about a year and a half ago. And here is a Japanese mayonnaise called Kewpie mayonnaise, and there you see the cupido on the cover. Not the cover, I'm so used to talking about books, you know what I mean, on the front. And you can get it in Canada. It's expensive. This cost me like $7 or $8, but it's so superior to anything you could possibly get in North America that I use it when I can afford it. So I hadn't even opened this one yet. So there it is, and I actually have a cupido. There it is. And I got this at a restaurant in Tokyo that used these at every place setting in the restaurant as the chopstick holder where you would put your chopsticks on it, and then you got to keep it. So I had dozens of them over the years because it was one of my favorite restaurants. It was a okonomiyaki restaurant, if you know what okonomiyaki is. If not, here's a picture. And this is one of my most sentimental souvenirs of my years in Japan, and this is a cupido. So what is a cupido? Cupidolls are an American invention, but they have sprung up and been popular all over the world. It actually came from a comic strip that was created by the cartoonist Rose O'Neill. They're basically like baby cupids, and some of them even had little hearts on them. The character emerged in her comic strip in 1909, and then it just took off. Then they started making the little dolls, and it began being used in advertising. Here's a Jell-O ad. And the dolls at first were made of bisque. I never did look up bisque. Bisque sounds like what they make biscuits out of, but this is obviously something different. What is bisque? Oh, bisque is a shellfish soup. That is obviously not. There must be another meaning. Unglazed china. Okay, well, I might have to do an, in other words, deep dive into bisque someday. But Cupid dolls were also found their way into suffragette ads and propaganda, and really popular in Germany, and were used in there were some soldier theme Kewpie dolls. Here's a picture of those. What about the mayonnaise? Toichiro Nakashima created the Kewpie mayonnaise brand after having worked and lived in the US. He founded his company in 1919, but he had been in the States before that working for the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce. And so he encountered this Kewpie doll and advertising and whatnot. His company first distributed canned salmon, but then he switched to mayonnaise in 1925. From the get-go, the Kewpie doll was the symbol. So that is why Kewpie mayonnaise is thus named, and this is still his company. I mean, he's long dead. He launched this brand 98 years ago. So I just think that's all very interesting. Rose O'Neill, the American cartoonist, the image and the idea came to her in a dream. The name Kewpie derives from Cupid. Cupid, Kewpie. Cupid, of course, means desire, love, and passion, and it comes from the Latin cupido, which has the same meaning. I think it comes from the Proto-Indo-European root called coupe, which means to tremble or to desire. Cupidity, the noun form for the quality, the characteristic, the desire, is primarily about the desire for wealth, but Cupid, in terms of Valentine's Day and all that stuff, is about baser, more bacchanalian desires. Here is another word from a Susan Scarlett novel that I read and loved earlier this year, Clothespekes by Susan Scarlett, which was the pen name of Noel Streatfeild, originally published in 1939. I have a full review of this, and I also have a full review of the Japanese novel, The River Key, so that both of those will be linked in the show notes. The word is seething or seethe. And this one, I knew what it meant, but why does it mean that, and what's the etymology? So the interesting thing about seethe is that the literal meaning is to boil or to be heated to the boiling point. And that literal meaning has not been in use in English for centuries, but originally that's what it meant. It's the figurative meaning, to be troubled in mind, to brood, and usually when I think of seething, I think of somebody raging, being really, really angry. Boil replaced the literal meaning, and only the metaphorical meanings do we use in English today. That metaphorical meaning has dates from the late 16th century. So it goes back to Old English, Proto-Germanic, Old Norse, Old Frisian, Dutch, Old High German, and goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root. I don't know how it's pronounced. Seut, here it is. And we get a few other interesting words from that Proto-Indo-European root. One I'd never heard of, sutler, a person who follows an army to sell food and liquor to the soldiers. Where's a good sutler when you need one? And that goes back to the same Proto-Indo-European root, and it's to do with the cooking, boiling, cooking. Also, suds. And if you think about soap suds, they look like boiling water, don't they? And that goes back to the original Proto-Indo-European root that we trace seethe to. And finally, this is a word that I can't believe I haven't talked about on this series, because it's a word that I've been curious about and wanting to do a deep dive on for quite some time, and that's condescend. We all encountered this word in our reading, and I think we all know what it means. In modern English, it means to give off a superior air and to be kind of in that superior egotistical way, to be fake in your friendliness to somebody who you feel you are obviously superior to. Patronizing, in the pejorative sense, is very similar. So condescension, to be condescending, to condescend to someone, the verb is not as common in modern times, is very, very negative. You are snobbishly faking some kindness or friendliness to somebody that you obviously consider yourself to be vastly superior to. Condescend. However, if you've read much classic fiction, especially before the middle of the 19th century, you will find that it had quite a positive meaning. And that's the part that I find so fascinating. up until maybe the mid-19th century, and you can find examples earlier and later where the negative and the positive meaning were still being used or were used earlier. But for the most part, before the middle of the 19th century, condescension was a good thing. It was a genuine expression of withholding all of the privileges of your rank to be genuinely, sincerely kind to someone of lower station or a lower class. And you can see in merry old England that that would have been at one time a good thing. All kinds of examples in Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, which I've been reading since it was published in 1758 or 68. No, I've been reading it for almost 3 years now. And all kinds of excerpts for this positive meaning. For example, let's see. Here's one of dozens and dozens. I am very proud of this condescension, and think it looks not amiss for you, as I am your avowed friend. So condescend, the verb came into English in the mid-14th century, and it originally referred to a god or a king making gracious allowance for human frailty. To yield deferentially comes from Old French, the verb meaning to agree, to yield, to come down from one's rights or claims, going back to late Latin and medieval Latin and all the Latin, the variations of Latin. The parts of it are con, C-O-N, which means with or together, descend, descendere means to descend or climb down, and that itself, descendere, comes from D-E, meaning down, and scandere, to means to climb, and that goes back. That part of it, scandere, if I'm pronouncing it right, who knows how it's pronounced, goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root scand, meaning to jump. In the period of Middle English, it didn't necessarily have a hierarchical meaning of coming down, or that was not the primary way it was used. It meant to meet somebody in the middle, to compromise, to consent to something, to make a mutual agreement or a concession. But by the early 15th century, it took on more and more of this connotation of genuine kindness and deference, even though you don't have to socially. Here are a few other words that come from the same Proto-Indo-European root, scand. Echelon, the step-like arrangement of troops, goes back to that Proto-Indo-European root, so you can see obvious connection between climbing and stepping. Descend obviously goes back to the same because it's got the same scandere part. Scandal, damage to one's reputation, going back to French, late Latin, and Greek. And originally, the farther back you go, I think especially into the biblical references and Greek, it meant to fall into a trap. And that is, you can also visualize stepping on a trap and getting caught in a trap. So that's where that comes from. Well, I hope you don't think I've been condescending, and I don't think I've set off any scandals, but I hope, regardless of how disappointed you might be about that, that you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching.